go live. Well, we're live. Do you know how to pull up the comments for YouTube and
Yeah, I
things
do.
like
I
that?
do. I
Perfect.
do. Yeah.
Great. Awesome. Welcome to the Merly End. I'm Dominic Machado, and today I'm joined by Estelle Vasudevan, Sri Lanka's #1 sports journalist, and Nick Brooks, Sri Lanka's foremost cricket historian. We have to start by saying what the date is. It's March 17th, 2025, 29 years on from that magical night in Lahore when Arjuna Ranatunga hoisted the World Cup Champions Trophy, a moment that will never be forgotten in Sri Lankan cricket history. And we're here to talk about that special, special night, to provide a little bit of a retrospective on it. And I want to start with just kind of a very broad question for both Estelle and Nick. What made this win and this campaign so special? Because I think, we talk about World Cup winning campaigns. We don't talk about the 2023 Australia World Cup winning campaign like this. We don't talk about, sort of the 2007 Australia like this. What makes this 1996 World Cup victory so special for Sri Lankans? And Estelle, I'll go to you first.
I think it's because it's the ultimate underdog story, right? If you look across all tournaments, all like global tournaments in cricket, I don't think you've had a less, you know, or more kind of surprising winner. You've had teams that have dominated. You've had teams that have been consistently good. I'm not saying that Sri Lanka wasn't good, but going into the tournament, we were kind of the babies of world cricket, right? We didn't have that reputation of being like a big tournament team because we hadn't played that many
Mhm.
tournaments leading up to that. And to come from that situation, I think it was it Rex Clementine or Cricinfo that had tweeted like the odds were 100 to 1. Now I don't know much about betting, but I would assume that 100 to 1 is like a really really tiny chance of going all the way, right? And to do it in those circumstances, and of course, barring like, if you forget about the cricket, Sri Lanka itself was going through such a tough period of time socially, right? With the war going on in the country, bomb blasts in the capital city, and that was one of the reasons that two teams refused to travel to Sri Lanka as well. So it is, to me, to date, it is the biggest fairy tale story of world cricket at the highest level. Like I'm sure you have like at championship level, at associate level, really really great stories, but I think at the highest level it's the biggest fairy tale.
Nick?
Yeah, I totally agree with what SD has said. Like, I think that probably the most pertinent factor is the underdog story. The odd I'd heard quoted was 66 to 1, but whatever way you slice it, they were like massive, massive outsiders. I think probably the 7th most fancied team going into the tournament, which just shows you how far down the pecking order they were. But there are so many factors that make this like an incredible story, right? As SD touched on, again, the central bank bombing, which almost derailed the tournament. Australia and West Indies said they weren't going to come to Sri Lanka. Kenya and Zimbabwe could have followed suit were it not for this like hastily arranged game on the eve of the tournament with a combined India-Pakistan 11, which is an amazing story in its own right. It was so rushed that I think all the sight screens had already been painted black for the tournament, and they had to repaint them white because this was going to be a red ball game. So, I mean, there are amazing factors. I think then you look at the kind of cricket that Sri Lanka played throughout that tournament, the freewheeling batting, how incredible they were in the field, the tactical kind of progression or modernity, this strangle by spin approach. And then I think you have to also see this like tournament as the coda to that Australian series, which came before it, which was super bad-tempered. It featured Murali getting called for chucking and numerous allegations of racism against that Australia team. And then you've got those two sides meeting again in a final. So it's like this kind of rivalry, this really fierce antagonism is resumed in a World Cup final in Lahore, which was, an amazing game as well. I'm sure we'll get into. But yeah, I think this tournament just has so much going for it in terms of like for UK listeners, I always think about Leicester winning the Premier League and Sri Lanka winning the World Cup in '96 as being similar kind of stories.
Yeah, I think the other thing that I would add, because I 100% agree with you, the geopolitical situation, the cricket situation, and to add to the cricket bit, these are sort of half professional cricketers at this point. They're not making enough money. They haven't been paid by the board. They're working other jobs at the same time. They're getting their bats from, teammates from other squads. They're not the 2014 Sri Lankan side that everybody knows, everybody loves, that's paid well, that's got political say, all those kind of things. This is a ragtag bunch that has been playing cricket actually for a while, right? If you think of Arjuna and Aravinda, they've been playing for more than a decade at that point, but they haven't been fully supported. And for a team, sort of a semi-professional team compared to, say, Australia or England or India at that time, to do it and do it on the biggest stage was absolutely tremendous. And the teams they beat also, we're talking about an Australia team that would go on to dominate the next 3 World Cups. And we're talking about an India team that had all-time greats in its side. So let's talk a little bit more about the tournament and the lead up to this. If we go back, Sri Lanka doesn't actually play its first game because, as Estelle said, Australia doesn't come to Sri Lanka, so they win by forfeit. They kind of get this luck of the draw, and then they face off against Zimbabwe. And what happens there is something kind of doesn't really go to form, because they're expecting Sanath and Kalu to have a good sort of opening partnership, but they hardly score any runs, and it's Aravinda de Silva to the rescue there, right? Can we talk about that lead up to the World Cup final, and what stood out to you? What players stood out to you? What tactics stood out to you? Because we've kind of alluded to those things as a tipping point, a changing moment in not only Sri Lankan cricket history, but cricket history overall. And I'll start with you, Nick.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to start with Sanath and Kalu, right? I was looking back this morning. So in that group stage game against India, where they went, I think it was in Delhi, they were 42 for none after 3 overs. And they chased down 271, which was a big chase in those days. I think they made 78 in the last 13 overs. Again, these are like paltry numbers by modern standards, but in 1996, those things were a big deal. And then again against Kenya, they were 83 for none after 6.4 overs. So they were getting the kind of starts which were just totally unprecedented in that era. So I think, yeah, you start with Sanath and Kalu at the top being incredibly explosive. I think someone who's kind of forgotten about in the context of this tournament is Asanka Gurusingha, who, like, for me, for this era of cricket, he was kind of the ideal number 3. People always talk about him as the rock in this batting order, which like more explosive players could build around. And I think he averaged 50 plus. He was run out, I believe, 3 times in 6 innings. So he could have scored more runs. He had that kind of ability to soak up pressure and then big power. I think he struck quite a lot of sixes in the back end of one of the group games innings, I think maybe against Zimbabwe or Kenya. I can't remember which. But then obviously you've got Aravinda, who was amazing throughout the tournament. And then you've got that big buffer, right, of 3 more batters in Roshan, Hashan, and Arjuna. I mean, then I think the other thing, so it's that already sets Sri Lanka apart, because the fact that they're using part-time spinners means they can field 7 frontline batters. And they had like the most incredible amount of experience especially in Asian conditions, right? So I think Arjuna's the most experienced player at the tournament. He had captained more games of ODI cricket than Mark Taylor had played. I think you've got like 800 plus caps between Arjuna, Aravinda, Hashan, Roshan, and Gurusingha and Sanath. No, the 6 of them, they've got like 850 ODI caps between them. So they've played a hell of a lot of cricket, most of it in Asia. And then the other thing I think is just like how good the spinners were throughout the tournament, how they were able to pick up wickets while keeping the runs down. So I've got some figures here. Sri Lanka bowled 134.1 overs in the knockouts, and the spinners bowled 95.1 of them.
Wow.
And as a unit, they went at 20.31 runs per wicket, going at basically 4 and over throughout the tournament. So when you think of like the length of the batting lineup and those contributions, they're basically match-winning impacts, right? In the quarterfinals, they bowled 35 overs combined, 155 runs for 6 wickets. In the semi, on like a pitch which broke down, they bowled 23.1 overs, 7 for 68 as a unit. So like those contributions, hugely important. I think you see in the final, Australia were going really well after 25 overs. And it's that period between 25 and 40 where I think the spinners really took control, and Sri Lanka won the game or Australia lost the game, depending on how you look at it. So sorry, I'm ranting. You get me onto history and I don't stop talking. But yeah, I think there were a lot of things Sri Lanka had going for it throughout the tournament.
Yeah, Estelle, what stood out to you in those sort of opening matches in terms of how this team came out and played and sort of topped their group? Obviously 2 walkover wins, but they get 3 other wins from 3 matches as well.
Yeah, firstly, I think Nick's point on the bowlers is really valid, because I think that's one thing that people don't really talk about. I mean, if you look at, I was looking for some pictures from the 96 World Cup, and if you look for Sri Lanka, I think probably 80% of them will be Arvind in the final, or Arjuna in the final, or them lifting the trophy, right? You don't really get that many of the bowlers. And in fact, if you look at how the tournament went, there were some games where Sri Lanka, the bowlers really had to dig them out, right? Like the way the spinners in particular were able to control things out in the middle. I think, like I said, it was a fairy tale. And sometimes when you talk about fairy tales, it's incredible how so many things seem to kind of fall into place. And in this case, I think the conditions, right? Sri Lanka have that many batters who can bowl, and the conditions are also very spin friendly. So they were able to go with those combinations that they wanted. I mean, if it was a tournament played in South Africa or Australia, where the pitches are much faster, perhaps they would not have been that effective. And if you look across that bowling attack, sure, now you look at it and say, you know what, Sanath was a great all-rounder, Aravinda was a decent all-rounder, Vas is a great, all-time great fast bowler, Murali is probably the greatest spinner in ODI cricket, right? But in 96, they were just average. Like none of them were superstars by then, right? They were all just there to do the job. And I think that's one thing that, like, looking back now, 20 plus years later, that's one thing that stands out. And of course, as Nick mentioned, that the batting order and getting Sanath and Kalu up the order, they would not have been able to play the way they played if they didn't have that, that set of batters to come, right? And the experience, as Nick mentioned again, even if you have 8 batters and some of them are newbies, then you kind of have that doubt, right, in your mind, will they be able to handle it? But I think Arjuna in particular had the faith that, look, even if Sri Lanka lose 5 wickets, they've got Roshan, Hashan and Vas Dharmasena to come, who can put some runs on the board. So it's just like, when you look at it now and think, how the hell did they have this belief, right? Like that they would win? Because there are so many stories about how I think when Australia said that they would not be traveling to Sri Lanka, was it there's a story that Arjuna had said, look, we want them in the final, we want to face them in the final. And he already had that confidence that Sri Lanka are going to go all the way in this tournament, right? And whether you agree with Australia's and West Indies' decision not to travel to Sri Lanka, personally, I can understand the perspective, because nobody wants to take a risk like that, right? But all of that, it turned into some kind of this fateful thing for Sri Lanka, right, where everything they needed to do was happening for them. So it's like, even when we talk about the Women's Asia Cup last year, I think that's something that comes up, right? Some things just you can't explain. It's not statistically something you can represent. Things just fall into place sometimes for teams. And I think, again, that's it for Sri Lanka, because who would have thought, right? Who would have thought they would be in that final? Forget about winning it. Who would have thought they'd
Yeah.
be in the final at the end of the day?
Yeah, and to call the shot, right? You have this testy series against Australia, and then to have your captain say, "We're coming for you and we're going to make you pay," right? And we're not afraid of you, right? That is sort of unheard of, right? The kind of bravado that Arjuna had, the kind of power that he had to kind of bring things around, to lead, to show how good this side was before they'd even shown it to themselves. And I think I'll add too, like the bowlers were quite young, right? The batters were experienced, but the bowlers were all sort of in the early stages of their career. So my next question, as we get another visitor to the show who wants to celebrate the '96 World Cup. Yeah, that's Dada. I'm curious about the knockout rounds, because those are some absolutely memorable games that are played. They're kind of, like you think about the World Cup and you think about the final, but without that knockout run. Let's start by talking about that game versus England, right? Because that's one of those games that, to me, it just kind of like so marked in my mind. We're not just here to play cricket. We're here to win this tournament. We're not here just for a small fight. We're here to win this tournament. Nick, tell us a little bit about that match, England versus Sri Lanka in the quarterfinals in Faisalabad.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I think of this match, that like basically the only thing that comes to my mind is that Jayasuriya innings, which was just like absolutely wild. But I'm just looking at the scorecard now, and Sri Lanka did really well with the ball. Right, they restricted England to 2-3-5, which was really par, I think, on a good Asgiria pitch. Well, no, it was in Faisalabad.
Faisalabad.
Yeah, and I think another thing to touch on that we haven't yet is like that they were so good in the field in this tournament. I think they were the best fielding side by a distance. And I remember I spoke to Guru Singha about this, my book, and he was saying like in every game we had the confidence that we were producing game-changing moments in the field, which like when you don't have necessarily the best bowling attack in the tournament gives you confidence that you can like, and pretty much if you look through every game in the 96 World Cup, there was either a run out from a direct hit or like a superb catch or some kind of moment where they were producing, and they got Robin Smith out when England had a decent start here and they got Robin Smith out with a direct hit, I think. And it's like one of those things that I always think about, because the 1987 World Cup, 2 editions before, Sri Lanka were like the worst fielding side by far. They dropped so many catches. And I remember talking to people and them saying that they were just disconsolate about it. And like, I think from about 1991, 92, Ranjit Fernando and Dilip Mendis started like drilling this team as basically amateurs, turning up after work in their like suits and ties and just like hitting high catches at them over and over again. And it sounds, again, really basic in terms of like modern cricket and what you think about professionals fielding sides doing today. But Sri Lanka's fielding came on so much in those years. So yeah, the run out sticks in my mind. And then that Jayasuriya innings, I mean, he was just like absolutely going berserk, right? For some reason, it sticks in my mind. There's a moment with Jeffrey Boycott on commentary where he says, I'm not going to do his Yorkshire accent, but he's like, this lot don't much like running singles. And then the next ball, Jayasuriya just like hits it onto the roof. Kind of, I think, an amazing, it was that. I mean, he only batted 13 overs. There's a famous story about how Wetamuni said he was going to buy him a watch if he batted 15 overs. And he didn't do it, and then Wetamuni still bought him the watch. But yeah, it's just like the wind was totally knocked out of England's sails, right, from that one innings. And so when Sanath got out, 113 for 2 they were after 13, chasing 230, and like, I mean, the job's done.
Yeah, chased it in 40 overs, right? So I mean, at that point, chasing anything above 230 in that amount of overs was almost like it's a anomaly, right? It doesn't happen.
Totally.
Yeah, it doesn't happen. And I think the other thing is when you look at Sanath's stats, right, for the tournament, he averaged 36. He faced on average like 28 balls per match. But and I think I feel like future in the future, some stats folks will look at this and be like, "What's the big deal about
Mm.
this run?" But what they forget is he ended two bowlers' careers in the span of two matches, right? Manoj Prabhakar had turned to bowling spin against him, and Phil DeFreitas in this game, right? They basically were he ended careers, right? And that is that to say that. Uh, he was so dominant, he was so powerful that he could just end the careers of these batters, and that teams feared him. They were like, "What are we gonna do if this, if we can't get him out?" Another thing to kind of reiterate the point that Estelle made about the bowling, right? Murali and Dharmasena were Murali bowled 10 overs, 37 runs, 2 wickets, and it's the wickets of Alex Stewart and Graham Hick, two of their best players with spin. And Kumar Dharmasena bowled 10 overs for 30 runs and 2 wickets, and he took the wickets of Graham Thorpe and Jack Russell. So, you're talking about a guy who just sort of or a spin doublet that kept everything calm, right? That kept everything easy and made sure that okay, 230, we can chase that absolutely. And they don't get enough credit for how good they bowled, especially given how inexperienced that bowling side
Mm.
was, right? Voss was young, Murley was young. It was amazing. So big win against England, and then we go to the semifinal at Eden Gardens against India. Estelle, what do you remember about that match?
Yeah, it's got to be the crowd, isn't it? I weirdly,
Mm,
I don't really remember that much from the World Cup. It's just like kind of moments of it that I can remember. But one thing definitely was Vinod
mhm,
Kambli at the end of that game, right? He crying as he left the field.
mhm,
I don't think India could have won it at that point, but it wasn't the kind of ending you would have wanted. But I mean, that game was one of those games where, if Sri Lanka had lost it, you would have had those comments like, you know what, this is the problem with your tactic of going all out in the first
mm,
15 overs. You lose Sanath and Kalu, um, and then the game's done when you try to attack that
yeah,
much. But Aravinda's innings, and I think a lot of people rate it as probably the best innings of his career, right? 66, and I don't think he batted 15 overs in that game. But by the
yeah,
time he was
no,
done, it was like the game was beyond the India. I think it was more psychological that the game was done,
yeah,
right? Because once India started batting, Sachin looked like Sachin, and he always made runs against Sri Lanka. But
yeah,
once he got out, it felt like suddenly the ball was ripping off the surface and like almost
mm,
unplayable, right? So like
yeah,
obviously the kind of the biggest memory would have to be the crowd problems. But it's remembered for cricketing reasons. Definitely Aravinda's knock, that 66. And I think was Kalu's the fantastic stumping was also that game, right? Sachin
Yeah.
in
yeah,
that game.
yeah, yeah.
So couple of moments. I
I,
I remember there was this interview with Upul Chandana, and he was talking about
mm,
like the crowd at Eden Gardens, right? Obviously, he was the 12th man in that team. He said, "Look, there are 100,000 people in the ground. I don't know what the capacity is, maybe 60, 70,000, but there are about 100,000 in the ground. And
mm,
then you have like 30,000 people outside the ground. So you genuinely, and at that time, like crowds could get violent, right, in India. And you
yeah,
genuinely don't know, like you fear for your life." And he was saying how, you know I think he was subbed on for Aravinda at some point, and he kept being put out to the boundary. um and he would get like the bottles on his head and stuff like that, and he had to come running in and let the umpires know. So like it was a dire situation at that point where
mm,
player safety it was something that was in doubt. So that will probably be the thing that a lot of people remember from that game, just watching it, because that's how it ended, right? But
Mm.
you know, just an incredible performance, as I said, like no runs from the top two, and to put on that kind of win against one of the hosts. And I think India was one of the best teams in that tournament as well, right, going
Yeah.
into it at least.
Yeah, absolutely. Nick?
Yeah, I think what's really interesting about this game, and people might not like me saying this, but I reckon if Sri Lanka win the toss, Arjuna would have chosen to bowl first and Sri Lanka would have lost the match.
Yeah.
I saw
Mm.
there hadn't been any cricket played at Eden Gardens since, or any international cricket played there since 1994, and the pitch had been buried under this really extravagant opening ceremony. And I think it just like totally crumbled, right? As Esti said, Sachin batted beautifully, but from the moment he got out, it looked really clear that Sri Lanka were going to win. I've got this like image in my mind of Sanath bowling these like balls well outside leg stump and just spitting off the surface. But yeah, I think, look, everyone who remembers this tournament properly and who followed it will tell you that this was the quintessential Aravinda knock, right? That the 100 in the final kind of pales into insignificance compared to this one. And it was just an incredible innings. Sri Lanka were 1 for 2, and he comes out, and it would have been so easy to sink into his shell, but he just refused to do that. And I mean, some of the shots he played, I think he was like whipping Kumble from outside off stump through the leg side, doing all kinds of crazy Aravinda things.
Yeah.
And as SD touched on, I think the biggest shift was in momentum, because he gets out for 66 or 47, but at that stage, Sri Lanka 85-4. So they're still like nowhere near out of the woods, right? But he just completely kind of changed the tone of the contest. He said, "We're not going to lie down. I'm coming at you." And from then on, yeah, it was kind of all Sri Lanka. I think this was the game as well. It's really easy to forget about, because clearly Aravinda steals the headlines here because it was such an audacious, memorable innings. But the insurance policy of Arjuna, Hashan, and Roshan really paid out. And I think especially Mahanama struggling with cramps made a like gritty 58, which carried Sri Lanka up to 250, which was like more than enough.
Yeah, you get 150 runs from Roshan, Arjuna, Hashan, and Voss, right? And that's what takes you to that total. Even though what we remember is just the ball pinging off of Aravinda's bat, right? He played a 47 ball innings and hit 14 boundaries. Like that's just ridiculous, right? And he's coming in at 2 for 1, right? Or 1 for 2, sorry, 1 for 2, and he scores 14 boundaries off of the 47 balls he faced. And very rarely can you say this in a match where Sachin played and scored runs, but Ravinda looked the best player in the world that day, and I don't think anyone who saw that match would doubt it. The other thing is, in as much as Sanath destroyed India the first time around with the bat, he destroyed them with the ball. He bowled 7 overs for 12 runs and took 3 wickets, right? So even though he didn't get any runs, he contributed with the ball and contributed a match-winning performance with the ball. And that was what was so special about, kind of the balance of this team, is that even if the guys didn't score runs, they could find other ways to chip in, be it with the ball, be it with the bat in the field, all those things. And what kind of scenes, as Estelle talked about, like just sort of the violence at the end, the fear that must have been in those cricketers' minds as they're trying to leave the stadium that has 150,000 people around it. And I think that fairy tale bit comes to roost here, right? Because as Nick said, if Sri Lanka batted second, this game may very well turn out completely differently. So now we come to that moment, right? 29 years ago, that final in Lahore. And there are all kinds of stories about the lead up to the match that are kind of amazing. Nick, could you tell us a little bit about your favorite sort of pre-match stories for this final?
Yeah, so I got two that I really love. One is I think both teams practiced on the same day. I think maybe 3 or 4 days ahead of the final. Sri Lanka practiced second, and by the time their practice wraps up at like 6:30, the dew is already kind of starting to form across the outfield. And then that evening there was some function they were supposed to go to, and Arjuna and Dilip basically sneak out of the function and head back to the Gaddafi and go and check on the ground. And they said that it was so wet that it was like as if it had been watered all over just from the dew. And so from that moment, Arjuna knew that he was going to want to chase if he won the toss, which had been their policy throughout the tournament and leading up. But I think the conventional wisdom at that stage was if you win the toss in a final, you put runs on the board. And like Aravinda wanted to bat first, Dav wanted to bat first, Imran Khan told them that bat first, but Arjuna was just like, I'm going to stick to my guns, we're going to chase. And I think Dew had a part to play in the end. So that's a cool little story. And then I love Pushpa's tale about buying carpets. I think the day before the tournament there was like a carpet vendor in the lobby of the hotel, and he'd gone in to try and buy a carpet, and the guys said, "Oh, you're in the Sri Lanka team, aren't you? Why don't you I'll give you a discount," basically, because Pushpa couldn't afford what he was quoting him. And so he went up and proud as punch with his carpet and showed it to all the team. And then the next morning Arjuna comes down for breakfast, and Australia are all there in the dining room, all in their team kit, sitting in silence, eating breakfast. And he's like, "Where the hell are all our guys?" And Dilip was like, "They're all bargaining for carpets in this showroom." And apparently he was really pissed off. He was like, "This is the biggest day in arguably Sri Lanka's like national history in a way. And like these clowns aren't taking it seriously." And he goes to the carpet intending to give them a bollocking and sees them all like relaxed, having a great time, bartering, buying carpets. Everyone's getting discounts. Some little carpets are being given for free. And then Arjuna says, like, "I realized that Australia are feeling the pressure and our guys are all totally relaxed." And then he says, eventually, like, "I started bartering for carpets too." And yeah, I mean, I just love that story. I think it's obviously it's silly, but I think it does express a fundamental truth that Sri Lanka were able to manage pressure really well throughout this tournament. They seem to have this kind of almost sense of nihilism throughout, that we're like, what's meant to be is meant to be. We've done our best. Didn't expect to get here. We are here. We're just going to enjoy it. And yeah, they had that amazing spirit throughout the tournament. I think Dav Watmore played a role in that. He strikes as a really kind of laid back, level-headed guy. And he told the team before the final, I think, like, "We plan to get to a semi. You've gone past that. This is a privilege. Go out and enjoy it." And yeah, I think when it came to the cricket, they handled the pressure better than Australia.
There's also that little bit extra with the carpet story. Something that I've heard is that there was like the session where they wanted to take the pictures with the trophy, and or like the Australian players were taking pictures with the trophy, and they had obviously called up Arjuna to come. And he had said, "No, don't worry, I'll take it once we win the tournament." That I don't know how far that's true, but I've heard it in some kind of interview. That kind of attitude he had was like, "You know what, we're going to have time to take those photographs once we've won the trophy." I think Nick is absolutely right with the attitude that Sri Lanka had. It's so like I said before, it's interesting to see how you wonder, like, if you look at it objectively and like during the build up, how Arjuna and Dav and Dulip had that kind of faith, that almost belief that Sri Lanka would make it that far, because there would have been no one who was thinking they would win, right? And like even Dav Watmore, isn't it true, Nick, that it was Australia, the Australian Cricket Board, that funded his pay because Sri Lanka couldn't afford to get him originally.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so the Australian Cricket Board said, "Look, we'll pay for him." So I mean, it's kind of like this cosmic connection, right, with Australia and the Benson and
Mm,
Hedges series before, and all that animosity that was there during that time.
mm,
Then they refused to come to Sri Lanka, and that's obviously taken as a slight by a lot of Sri Lankans. I think every Sri Lankan at that point took it as an insult that they are refusing to travel to Sri Lanka, and then to
mm,
go on and beat them. And remember, this is a team, like Dom mentioned before, who went on to dominate, right? They dominated cricket, like ODI cricket in particular, for the next 10 years. Like, they were
mhm,
the force in colored clothing. So it's amazing how it all circles back to this, and that belief that Arjuna and obviously the leaders of that team instilled in them. And I guess there's also that element of they had nothing to lose, right? Because, like I said, like,
mm,
no one is expecting them to do anything. And making it to the final itself was great. And then also another thing I would say is, like, the support Sri Lanka had. I remember reading as a child how, like, Indian shop owners had named their shops after Sanat
mm,
Jayasuriya and Aravinda De Silva. Like, it's incredible. And I don't think it's something we see now, right? Because fan bases have become so, like,
mhm.
kind of nationalistic and a bit toxic in that sense, that you wouldn't see that anymore. Like,
Yeah.
that outward support of another
Mm,
cricketer. But playing in Lahore, the support that Sri Lanka got from the Pakistani fans, right? It just incredible. I can only imagine how incredible it would have been to actually be there and witness it all.
mm. Yeah, I think the thing it gives you chills, right? All of the coincidences, all of sort of the cosmic boomeranging that happens in this tournament. And it's like if you wrote a fairy tale, you couldn't come up with something this good. And I think one of the things that stands out to me or that I think about is maybe part of the reason they didn't feel pressure is because so many things were happening in their lives that were much worse than this, right?
Yeah.
We talked about the situation in Sri Lanka, worrying about the safety of family members, of loved ones, worrying about what's going to happen when their children go off to school. All these questions and concerns. Um, Cricket was a welcome distraction in some ways. It was a holiday from a world that maybe wasn't a world that wasn't ideal, right? A world that had lots of troubles and problems. And I think they also took it upon themselves that we can give the people of this island who are struggling something to smile about for one day, right? There was something special about that too. Let's talk about the match. I think, and Estelle, kind of you alluded to this, it didn't start out particularly great. You know, Australia goes into bat. Mark Taylor is looking in imperious form. He puts on this 100-run partnership with a young mustachioed Ricky Ponting, right? And they're 137 for 1 after 26.1 overs. So you're thinking, okay, 300 is on the cards for this squad. And then it's that spin bowling attack that really turns the screws. Um, and of all the people, it's Aravinda De Silva who picks those first 2 wickets. First, he gets Taylor to hole out, and then he gets Ricky Ponting bowled. And then probably my favorite ironic moment from this is that Australia promotes Shane Warne to kind of smash about the spinners, and Murali gets him stumped. Beautiful stumping by Kalu. And it's kind of it's this prefiguration of this rivalry that will last throughout the entirety of their careers. But Estelle, tell us a little bit about that 26 to 40 over period and how Sri Lanka was able to kind of claw it back.
Yeah, as you said, it was the spinners, right? Because remember, Australia is coming into this final kind of red hot favorites, right? They'd basically snatched victory out of the jaws of defeat in the semi-final
Mm,
against the West Indies. Shane Warne had basically, he turned the match on his own, right, in that game. And then they'd been playing well, and it was just that one game that they forfeited to Sri Lanka that was kind of the blip for them, right?
mm,
um, and they had the players to really go all the way in this tournament, I think, because Mark Waugh was in superb form. I think he
yeah.
was the highest run getter in the tournament, if I'm not mistaken. Taylor was good. Ricky Ponting, of course, Steve Waugh, Stuart Law, Michael Bevan, right? They had the bowling attack, sorry, the batting lineup, and they did have the bowling attack also to go all the way. So they would have come in with that amount of confidence. And as you mentioned, when that partnership was going, Sri Lanka were looking a bit dead. But I think if they'd learned anything throughout the tournament, it's that to have faith in that bowling attack, in their ability to strangle, right? More
Mm,
than being like wicket taking options. I think the likes
yeah.
of like Dharmasena, Aravind, Sanath, and even Murali to a great degree, they would just not give you easy runs. You'd have to
Yeah.
make like you have to make a play as a batter, right? You have to use your feet, you have to use the crease really well. And they kind of, I think Arjuna also, the way he used Aravind had, can you imagine having a day like that, right?
Yeah.
In the biggest match of your life. And this was the guy who kind of everyone, everyone knew he could be great, but he was kind of hit and miss sometimes, right? He would have great
Mm,
games, he would have bad games, he'd come out and play that lazy drive and get out. And then he has this day where he bowls brilliantly, he feels
mm,
brilliantly, and then of course
yeah.
he comes out and plays that innings, right? So I think that faith was kind of the thing that kept them in the game during that middle period was that. And as Nick mentioned earlier in the podcast, the fielding was
Mm,
consistently good, right? And so pair that with the kind of tight lines and lengths of the spinners, and Australia really struggled to score. And I think that's where the frustration and some of the shots came out. And even for them to promote someone like Shane Warne to go after the bowling, they knew that it's not going to be 230, 240 is not going to be a good enough total. They would
mm.
have to get a bigger total because of the dew and all of that coming in. So they were on the back foot despite that partnership between Ponting and Mark Taylor. They knew they had to do something extra to put a
Yeah.
winning total on the board.
Yeah, I think the fielding, I mean, Aravinda's 2 catches were huge as well, right? So he's basically making everything happen, and you could
Mm.
argue even without the batting innings, he could have been, man of the match, right? I remember and watching it over, I remember watching the last couple overs when Michael Bevan is in, and, Michael Bevan as an ODI finisher is one of the first great ODI finishers, and he gets some runs on the board, right? They've kind of strangled Australia, keeping them at like 3.5, 4 runs and over for 20 overs. And Bevan smashes a couple. And Nick, what was the sense you get of the Sri Lankan dressing room when they kind of go from 202 for 7 with 3 overs to play to, okay, now we have to chase 242 down?
Yeah, it's really interesting because Mike Marquisi talks about this in his great book, War Minus the Shooting. He was in the press box that day. And I think he basically said that at the halfway stage, he was the only journalist who was picking Sri Lanka to win. So I think maybe, yeah, Australia had a good little finish, right? But I think
Mm.
Sri Lanka would have been really pleased from 150 for 230 overs to have kept them under 240. I think was an amazing achievement. And oh no, it was 241 they got to, so not quite. But I think what really sinks like hits home for me is if you look at after Taylor and Ponting got out, how few boundaries they
Mm.
conceded. So War faced 25 balls, no boundaries. Law faced 30 balls, 1-6, no 4. Bevan
Mm,
faced 49 balls, 2 4s. So kind of, and then Healy and Rifle, no boundaries. So they were fielding really tightly. They weren't conceding boundaries at all. I mean, it was an amazing effort in the field. Talk about Aravinda's
mm,
batting, but as Estelle said, he had an amazing all-round game. The off break that he got Healy with was a really special one,
yeah.
and that skied catch that he took on the run. I think that I think Sri Lanka believed the whole way through. I think they like Arjuna walked out for the toss like a man who knew he was going to
Mm,
win, and I think that confidence only grew through the course of this field innings. But then they did have a blip, right? I mean, if we look at the start of their batting innings, Sanath almost run himself out of the 8th ball of the innings and then got run out the next
Yeah.
ball. Kalu goes early,
yeah.
like slapping one straight to square leg. And I think there was a moment also where Aravinda and Gurusingha early in their partnership where I can't remember, one of them hit a ball straight to a fielder and went like running halfway down the pitch and almost got run out. So like it's easy in hindsight to think that Sri Lanka really cruised this chase, but they were 23 for 2. They had that kind of those early jitters, right? Which I think start to get put to bed by how serenely Aravinda batted, and like it wasn't one of his most explosive innings, but it was just like really kind of considered. He was just chipping away at that target, and again, Gurusingha played a crucial hand.
Yeah, I was gonna say we should give our props to Gurusingha's innings here, because he kind of was the rock that held it together, right? Knowing that if his wicket fell, it would be a much tougher chase. He kind of held it together, and then when Shane Warne comes on, he lets loose, smashes him for a 4, smashes him for a 6, kind of lets this guy who's regarded as one of the world's foremost spinners, and who is just, he's the guy who basically dug Australia out of that nearly unwinnable position against the West Indies in the previous match, right? And saying, we're in charge, I'm in charge here. And you just look at the raw power that he had. He's such a big built-made guy that it was amazing. And he got put down a couple times. That was definitely to Sri Lanka's benefit. But Estelle, you talked about Aravinda's bowling and fielding. Tell me about that 100, that 107 that we'll never forget.
It was almost like, I feel like looking back, as I said, I don't really remember too much about it, but looking back and watching videos of how he was batting, it was almost like he knew, right, that there's no way you're getting me out today. That was the thing with Aravinda. I feel like he is so highly rated because he sometimes, when he was in kind of what they call the zone, it didn't feel like he would get out, because he could play every shot in the book. He was so quick on his feet, right? He played spin well, he played pace really well. He just looked like it's inevitable. He's going to take Sri Lanka to the win, right? And I think, again, to come back to like, the mental stuff, the psychological stuff, that performance with the ball for sure, and with the catching, would definitely have given him like the confidence that this is your game, right? Because you don't often see Aravinda fielding like that, like taking those kind of catches. He was everywhere on the field, right? So that confidence, I think, would have taken him a long way. You remember the kind of the drives he used to, for me, that's like the distinct thing about Aravinda, right? He doesn't really get his foot to the pitch of the ball and plays those drives almost on the up. And it's like a lazy elegance. It's not, it's almost energy efficient, if you can say that, the way he plays the drive, right? Because he doesn't really like, there's no big flourish or anything like that. But when it hits the bat, it's going for a boundary. And we spoke so much about the kind of the Mad Max innings in the semi-final. It was like two different players. It was the same shots, but there was no frantic batting in the final. He still scored at a fair clip. I think he got 107 off 124, striking at 86. In that era, that was pretty good. But he didn't look like he was in a hurry to get anywhere, right? He just kept chipping away, as Nick said, with the mindset that Sri Lanka going to get there if he stays at the crease. And I mean, when I say that, my mind goes back to another story Arjuna had mentioned in one of the interviews, right? About how they knew that Aravinda was the guy who's going to win them a World Cup. And there's this story about him. Apparently, he used to like to listen to English music. And because like Aravinda was the man for the team, basically everyone else had been told, look, let him do his thing. He gets what he wants. Stay out of his way, kind of thing, right? And he used to get into the tour bus, and he used to just slip in one of his English cassettes and listen to that music. And of course, many of the guys didn't like that, right? The teammates didn't like it. So apparently they collected money and bought him a Walkman so that they could listen to the sinhala music that they wanted, and he would have his private English music to listen to. And it's crazy how, like, you wonder how much of confidence that instills in a player like Aravind, right? And there are lots of theories
Mm.
on how he got the nickname Mad Max. One of it is that because he used to be so unpredictable and, crazy when he batted. I think was it Nick who told me this about, domestically, because he was so reckless. Um, people would call him Mad Max for that reason. That others say that it was because he was so good. Either way, like, to tell that kind of player, you're going to win us the World Cup, so you can do whatever you want. We will make you as comfortable as possible. It's kind of crazy, right, when you think about it?
Yeah.
Because nowadays, I'm sure there are diva players who in the team who want things the way they want and aren't given that, because there's like this whole discipline. And it's weird because Arjun is this, you know,
Yeah.
disciplinarian, right? He wants things in a certain way. But for Aravinda,
Yeah.
it's like that's what leadership is, right? You identify what each player needs to be as good as they can be. And I think that's probably the biggest takeaway from that 96 World Cup is probably that. They understood what their strengths are,
Yeah.
and they understood what each player needed to perform at their best.
And I think that's something about the experience of playing together, right?
Mm.
Arjuna had played with Aravinda for a decade. He'd seen the highs, the lows, and he had figured him out. He said, okay, he just needs to be doing what he wants in order to, do what he does. And I think that lazy elegance you talk about, the drives, he always kind of looks like he's about to fall over, or even the flicks through the leg side, he looks like he's about to fall over, but ping, and it just goes off the bat. And he was so talented. I remember reading about how he used to shadow bat at night before the tournament, and everyone used to ask, "What are you doing?" He said, "I'm imagining going against Glenn McGrath, or I'm imagining going against Anil Kumble." And Nick, you'll probably be able to fill in the details, but I remember him also saying he wanted to bat with a heavier bat because that's the way Sachin batted. And he thought that it would be helpful for his game, and that he switched to a different bat in the middle of the tournament, right? And I think we've talked about this before, the ability to just kind of play with your technique and still look completely comfortable out there is something, it's one of the reasons why people rate him so highly of the Sri Lankan batsmen, and batters. We've produced so many great ones. I think if you asked those batters we include on the list who the greatest of all time is, almost all of them would say it's Aravinda.
100%.
So yeah, go ahead, Nick. Go for it.
No, I think, like as you touched on, Dom, I think he changed to that heavy about halfway through the tournament to and he'd never used a bat like that. And Wetamuni was just like tearing his hair out, being like, what the hell is this guy doing? But he always made it work. And there's such a contradiction with Aravinda, like that he's this reckless, crazy guy. I had stories that he used to drive, breaking his batting gloves, doing wheelies down the Gould Road. But then everyone around him always says like big game player. And, in England, people talk about the B&H final that he played for Kent, where he made this like masterful 100. And then here a year later, he does a similar thing. And as Estelle touched on, like the highlight from this innings is control. I think, Arjuna really understood his own players, and I think he understood the opposition as well. I love this story about the interviews the night before, and he said to Chappell, Warne's just an average spinner, and Warne kind of like ran over to Chappell afterwards and was like, what's that fat bastard said about me now? But like he really got under Australia's skin. Like Ian Healy couldn't stand him, Warne couldn't stand him, and I think that rivalry got into Australia's heads. And he was Arjuna's kind of thought of as purely a captain, right? But I think especially at this stage of his career, he was such a good finisher, especially in chases. And when he comes to the crease at the 30 overs gone, Sri Lanka still need 94 off 119. And I think between 30 and 36, they only scored 17. And it would have been very easy to panic at that point. But these two old pros kind of really marshaled the situation really effectively. And then typically when Warren came on, Arjuna was just like, I'm having him. There's that famous moment where the ball goes through Warren's fingers off that court and bowled. And I think it is fair to say, like Stuart Law dropped a catch on the boundary. I think that Dew was hampering Australia, but I think it's also fair to say that, you know, like Warren was basically a non-factor, and I think part of that was down to Ranatunga getting into his head of it.
Because right after that drop catch where it burst through his hands, he bowls basically a full toss that Arjuna just whacks for 6.
It's basically beating them at their own game, right? Like Shane Warne was notorious for kind of planting these ideas in opposition head. And Arjuna did basically the same thing to him, like.
Yeah, you know, they you know, he stood up to the bully by being a bully, right? Saying, if you're gonna take it to us, we might as well do it. We're not taking it lying down. And I think Arjuna's innings is like, or at least the cricketing role that Arjuna played outside of captaincy is a little bit underrated in this tournament. As Nick said, one of the best finishers in the world. He's striking at over 100 throughout the tournament. He comes in these tricky situations, and he knows how to get more than a run a ball. He's nudging, nerdling, he's jogging, he's doing all these things. You know, you think of how he put it all together, or to kind of by hook and crook to get them over the line. It was really amazing. And then that final shot that Arjuna plays, right? It's just such an Arjuna shot, right? That little dink behind the, you know, past the keeper, and he immediately knows it's going for 4, and he picks up the wicket. And just runs away. He knows he's done it. One story I want to kind of talk about, and I know I've talked with, I think, both of you about this story, is the story of the 12th man in the World Cup final, Ravindra Pushpakumara. So supposedly Pushpa was basically the messenger for this match. The problem was Pushpa's English was not very good at that point. And Dave Watmore kept on feeding him messages, telling, you know, Gursinha to kind of take it easy, not try to hit the spinners for 6, tell Aravinda to stay there, all these things. But Pushpa didn't remember or recall. He just told Gursinha and Aravinda to just keep on batting and keep on doing what they're doing, because he didn't know what the message said. And it's just such a quaint, amazing story that kind of sums up to me like the state of Sri Lankan cricket at that point and how they won, and kind of like the mixture of factors that would seem to make it impossible, but somehow drove them to a victory. So should we turn a little bit to the comments here, since we've kind of reviewed the game, reviewed the run-up? Okay, first question. Hi, guys. Where's Mark? Is he stuck in the 96 World Cup celebration? I think he's in Paris, and he's somehow gotten the Eiffel Tower to have a blue and yellow streak today in honor of the celebration. Yeah. What do you guys think about this? Is 96 the turning point in our cricketing journey?
Yeah, it's got to be, right? Like, I think people started taking us seriously, that Sri Lanka can play, and Sri Lanka they're not just there to make up the numbers, and they're not just there to be like the kind of underdog who punches above its weight, right? They're there as a legitimate competitor. So yeah, definitely changed, like it changed the course of where cricket was going in Sri Lanka. Because if you look at it this way, I was 7 years old when Sri Lanka won the World Cup. I don't know if my generation of people would have been that cricket crazy if that World Cup win didn't happen. Like some of the cricketers who played for Sri Lanka, we don't know if like they would have been as kind of, if they would have taken that path if Sri Lanka didn't win the World Cup in 96, because it was such a huge moment, right? And this is time before the internet. Everything was kind of word of mouth, and TVs, and that social element was so much higher during that time. So I wonder if all our lives would have been different if Sri Lanka didn't win, not just the cricketing team,
Mm.
the cricket team.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's such a huge turning point, and I think you see the confidence that floods into the team as a result, right? They went to Singapore straight afterwards for a tri-series, and Sanath, I think, then
Mm.
breaks all these records. I think he scores the fastest 50 in ODI cricket, the fastest 100, albeit on a really small boundary pitch. But like you see that there's a quote from Dav, I think that like that was when he transitioned to being one of the seniors. And I think, as Estelle touched on, like the whole world perception of Sri Lankan cricket changed, right? There had been real struggles to get like even broadcasters for Sri Lanka series prior to this, and suddenly they were like really hot property throughout 96 and 97. Sri Lanka became kind of like this Harlem Globetrotters type team who were doing just like wild shit in ODI cricket. And yeah, the whole world wanted to watch it. Then, I mean, I think you also have to touch on the fact that like Anapunchi Hayward gets sacked at board elections right after, and suddenly there are all kinds of people wanting to get their claws into the board, and maybe some of the problems which started to spring up a lot later stem from this time. But I mean, yeah, an amazing moment which transformed like Sri Lankan cricket.
Yeah, I'll add one small thing too. I think it's a turning point too for Murali's career, right? In the sense that um, that confidence they get from winning that World Cup goes a long way to ensure that he has a career he does, because 95, 96 very well could have been the end of his cricketing career, and we would have been robbed of, one of the greatest figures to ever grace the cricket field. But winning this World Cup, having the backing of his captain, right? It kind of sets him on that path. Okay, so we have Dineth. Sri Lanka has always had a great, almost unmatched unmatched depth of batsmen who can bowl part-time or even proper spin. I think that's why we're so successful at home, where we can make our batting very deep, right? I think this is what we talked about, right? You can play 7 batters when this happens. And I think, and the question I'd like to throw out to both of you is, what's the future of this tactic? I would have said, if you asked me a year ago, that this tactic is basically dead and buried. But what we've seen from Sri Lanka playing at home and then from this Champions Trophy, I'm not quite sure if it's dead just yet.
I think it maybe seems dead because we watch so much less ODI cricket than we used to.
Yeah.
And it's not a strategy for T20s or really for test matches. But I think it can still be really effective in 50 over cricket. And you see that teams who go like 6-5, it just doesn't really work. You need some batters who can bowl overs. And I think finger spin in the middle overs is like especially effective because if you can get on a pitch that takes a little turn, you don't need to be Murali or Warne to be effective in 50 over cricket, right? And I think that it does have a future. I think it'll be interesting the next World Cup because South Africa people obviously associate with pace and bounce, but we've seen in the SA20 some more kind of spin friendly pitches. And I think if Sri Lanka can have, Charith, Wanindu, Welalage in that 11 and have kind of guys who can bat and get through overs of spin, for me, it's a really effective, crucial component still in ODI cricket.
Yeah, I think there's a place for it. I think even in T20 cricket, right, where you've got it does give your team so much more flexibility when you've got a top order bat who can bowl a bit, whether it's spin or pace or whatever, can fit in that 1 or 2 overs. Because basically, like if you look at 96, Sanath and Aravinda were basically like full-time bowlers, right? They kind of had that element of being a 2-in-1 player where they could give you 10 overs when you needed to, because those pitches were conducive to their type of bowling. So I think it has a lot to do with conditions as well. Like I think it would more likely be useful if you had top order batters who could bowl spin in spin bowling conditions,
Mhm.
rather than pace, guys who can bowl a bit of pace in pace friendly conditions, because that's not necessarily the same, right? Like if you look at
Yeah.
the conditions Sri Lanka have been dishing out to teams in ODI cricket in Sri Lanka, then that we've already seen, right, the likes of Charita Lanka having a lot of success. So I
Yeah.
think it does have a place, but it's dependent very much on conditions, which, I mean, to be fair, was the case in '96 as well, right? Like I mentioned before, if the venues were different, probably you wouldn't have seen the Sri Lankan bowling lineup be as good as it was at that time. So conditions dependent, but I think it still does have a place in international cricket. I mean, not to forget, Dilshan was like that player for
Yeah.
his entire career as well, right?
Mhm. Yeah, exactly. You know, India has kind of been doing this with Akshar Patel, right? Batting him at 5 and having him bowl spin in the middle overs, right? And all reports seem to be that they view him as a difference maker in that role. And then you have the guys like Aidan Markram or Glenn Phillips who've just kind of learned to bowl 1 or 2 overs. Like they just have just good enough stuff and they're valuable in T20 cricket. So I think it's something we should continue to kind of think about and work on with obviously adaptations. Okay, great question from Sanjit. What mindset should Sri Lanka women or any team learn from the 96 team to do well in the World Cup this year and in the future? Estelle, I'll start with you. What do you think future teams can take from the example of 96?
I think it's a bit tricky, right? I'm going to try and explain this the way I understand, because it feels like a kind of half-formed idea in my head. But I feel like in '96, teams weren't as professional as they are now, right? So there was a lot
Yeah.
more of the, if you were talented enough, you would do well. Whereas I feel like that's not the case anymore, right? Because now everything is so regimented, and you've got so many structures in
Mhm.
place. The talent alone or mindset alone is not going to take you as far as it would have 30 years ago. So I feel that is definitely a kind of caveat we have to think about. But in terms of mindset, I think that I've spoken about it right throughout this podcast, right? The the unshakable belief they seem to have in their abilities.
Mm.
I don't know if they were thinking too much about what the other team is doing, but they
Yep.
had this kind of unshakable trust that these are their tactics and this is how they're going to use it, and this is how they're going to go all the way, right? So I feel like that belief is important, but there are so many factors, man. Like I said, it
Mm.
felt like everything kind of, it tornadoed into this perfect moment for Sri Lanka.
Yeah.
So I don't know how much of that you can replicate, but yeah, there are certainly things like Nick spoke about experience, right? And that's something that we don't really think about. Like if you look at that batting
Yep.
lineup, the amount of experience they had in it enabled Arjuna to kind of make those plans, or the leadership group to make those plans, because they understood
Yep.
how each of these players played. And I feel like that is one of the very few benefits of having a small pool to select from, is that like the
Yep.
same players, and we've seen this with the women's team as well, right, where you have a really, really narrow or small pool of players to select from. That inevitably means that the same players get a lot of opportunities, which means that you tend to understand their strengths, and they also understand their roles much better. So that could be another thing that maybe can be looked at from the '96 World Cup.
Nick?
Yeah, I agree with everything Esty said. I think, as she touched on, self-belief is huge, something that they can really
Mm.
take from this 96 side. I think another thing is how much of a difference you can make with fielding and energy in the field. I think
Mhm.
we have seen with the Sri Lanka women's team, right, when they take an early wicket, you feel a notable change in their intensity. Suddenly you can hear them on
Yeah.
the stump mics. Everyone's going really hard. You need to have that energy all the time. Not just when you're like, your tails need to be up all the time, not just when you're doing well. And so I think that's something that they can take, that, you know, if they can trim 15, 20 runs off totals by being full of energy, by getting direct hits, by taking great catches, then that's a real boost. And that is something that ultimately comes down to practice, training, repetition, right? How good you are in the field.
Mm.
I guess the third thing is, and this is a bit trickier to kind of put your finger on how to do it, but it's like, don't be afraid to try things and to be tactically innovative, and, you know, don't see your shortfalls necessarily as weaknesses, but think of ways to overcome them. Like Sri Lanka bowled 13 overs of seam in the final, you know, Vas and
Mhm.
who was it, not Pushpa, it
Pramodya.
was Pramodya.
Pramodya.
Yeah, we're like,
Rodeo, yeah.
were not the best seamers in the tournament, and most teams were going with more than two. But Sri Lanka were like, we're going to do what we do well. These guys don't even have to bowl their full complement, because we're going to figure out another way to
Mhm.
do things. And maybe that's harder to do in the modern era, as SD touched on, because everyone's more professional and more drilled. But I think that kind of solutions-based thinking, rather than focusing on weaknesses.
Yeah, I think the other two things I'd add to this, I agree with both of you about your points. I think trying something different, right? What can you do to get the most out of a player who you think has some talent, right? With Sanath, we saw him lingering in that lower middle order role, and then we'll say, okay, well, let's bring him up to open, right? What kind of ways can you unlock the skill sets of the players that you already have? Is it taking someone like Anushka Sanjeevani and saying, "Hey, why don't you open the batting?" Right, which she's done occasionally to good results. I think it also shows me that if you think about the time span that Arjuna had, right? Basically, like if you imagine 12 months, right? That was the build up. 12 months of total buy-in to this way of playing cricket, right? Which reminds you, you don't need to be preparing for 4 years if you have a mindset, if you ruthlessly follow that mindset and play it and believe it, right? Because I think based on the form that Sri Lanka showed in 95, you would have said, okay, they probably will do okay in this tournament, but we're not expecting them at all to win, right? We want it all to sort of hit the high point right at in during the World Cup, right? And I think that kind of happened a little bit with the 2024 Asia Cup. The women played so well; they were playing their game so well that they were able to win it by putting it all together. I think the men in 2022 also did that with the Asia Cup. But can you do that on the biggest stage in the World Cup and not empty the tank beforehand? I think that's the other thing is peaking at the right moment, right? And I think maybe this is where the long-term and short-term thinking can get into trouble. Winning the Asia Cup is great, but winning the World Cup is better, right? So, what sacrifices might you need to make in the short run to have that magical moment in Lahore again, right? Obviously, it's not going to be in Lahore again, but yeah. Okay,
It's never going
Sanjit,
to
do
be
we have a
Lahore
book that
again, is it?
describes Sri Lanka cricket journey? No, it's never going to be Lahore again. Well, yeah, yeah. We won't talk about the what ifs there. So Sanjit asked, "Do we have a book that describes Sri Lanka's cricket journey in 1996?" The answer is yes, written by our very own Nick Brooks. He has several chapters devoted to this amazing moment in his Islands 11. Go buy it, Nick. Um, it's amazing to read it and like there's so much detail. Got to give it a shout out. It's great. Sanjay, go get it. It's worth however much you need to spend to read that. Um,
Thanks, man. I would
anything
also
else that
pick
you
up a couple, as I mentioned earlier, War Minus the Shooting by Mike Marquisi is like a
yeah.
really amazing reflection on the whole tournament, not just on Sri Lanka, but what it
Mhm.
meant from a wider cricketing perspective. He writes beautifully and explores some really interesting angles. He also goes to Sri Lanka during the tournament and watches Mahela when he was playing for Nalanda and talks about him as a future star, which is kind of cool. And another one that you should check out if you're in Sri Lanka, I think this book's easier to buy, is Ranjan Melawa, Winds Behind the Willow, I believe it's called. And this presents like a really beautiful perspective of the tournament from a fan. Ranjan has been to loads of World Cup finals, and he was on the charter which Sri Lanka organized when the team got to the final. And he talks about like going to the Pakistan embassy and getting the visa. And he's got some really cool stories about, I think he was staying in the same hotel as the team, and he was like trying to find the party afterwards, I seem to remember. And there's a story about Kumar Dharmasena, like he sort of opens the door into Dharmasena's room and he's there like eating some rice, being like, I wish these clingers on would just fuck off. So yeah, check out Ranjan's book. It's got some great stories.
Oh, that's amazing.
And something that we haven't spoken about, which I think Ranjan mentions, is the flight back, because the team got shoved onto this charter. There wasn't enough room for them. So they were like sitting on the floor. I think Aravinda and Roshan's dads were like organizing this big Baila sing song. There was free booze. So everyone kept going to the front of the plane and had to be told to sit down because like the plane was literally getting unbalanced. And it was flown by Sunil Wetamuni, and he and Dilip were the two guys who got hospitalized by Jeff Thompson when Sri Lanka first played a World Cup in 1975. And so I think it's so lovely that here they were 21 years later sharing in this moment where Sri Lanka had come so far.
Yeah. The other must read I enjoyed, it's not a book, but Andrew Fidel Fernando's The Lion's Fairy Tale it's one of those things. It's about 10 years old, but it really captures beautifully the essence of the moment. Well, I think that's all we have for today. I've thoroughly enjoyed this retrospective, and I'm going to listen again because, hey, who doesn't love to hear all about the 96 World Cup? We will be back in a couple of days for more. We're going to wrap up the women's series in New Zealand. The third T20 is for me tonight, or this morning for those in Sri Lanka. And we'll do a little preview of Sri Lankan cricketers in the IPL, because it's going to be a pretty exciting season for Sri Lankan players in the IPL. Well, we've been the Murley End. Thank you. Bye.